Welcome to the RE Podcast, the first dedicated RE podcast for students and teachers.
My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is, and I'll prove it to you. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Freddy Naftel to the RE Podcast. Now, his Twitter handle says he is a composer, Holocaust speaker, percussionist and teacher, so quite a remarkable person. And he's here to talk to us about anti-semitism. So welcome, Freddy.
Thank you. Hello, Louisa.
I mean, is there anything else you need to say by way of introducing yourself?
That was pretty impressive. I'm quite impressed myself. I think first and foremost, I am a Holocaust educator, but music has always been an interest of mine. I taught it at high school and sixth form college. I write music and I enjoy playing. But I sort of give equal attention, if not more attention, to my work as a Holocaust Judaism educator as well.
Fabulous. Well, let's dive straight in and let's start with the history of Judaism, because it's actually a much older religion maybe than people think.
It is, yes. In fact, the year we're in right now is, in the Jewish calendar, it's the year 5782. And Judaism is the oldest religion of all. It's the oldest faith. It has sort of been the catalyst for most of the faiths that have come after it, certainly Christianity. And there is a connection also to Islam and the Baha'i faith and also Druze as well. There are many similarities because we're all, Abrahamic religions.
Absolutely. So what does it actually mean then to be Jewish?
Well, it's very difficult to actually say because, as with most religions, Judaism can be divided up into various categories. There are those who perhaps feel themselves Jewish but don't observe all the laws. There is the sort of orthodox and ultra-orthodox Jewish sect who follow things to the actual letter, and they live a different life entirely. So I was born into a very traditional, conservative Jewish family. Those are my origins. So I was brought up just to understand that, yes, I was Jewish and that I followed this faith. I went to Jewish Sunday school from about the age of 5 onwards, but I attended a normal mainstream school. Going to synagogue every Saturday was really part and parcel of what it means to be Jewish. But I never thought of myself as exclusively a Jewish person. I happen to be a person who follows the Jewish faith. And over the years, I have perhaps become less strict in my observance of the faith. But I feel an absolute kinship with the religion because of my family story, because my parents brought me up that way. So being Jewish today is just as important as being Christian, as being Muslim, in fact, any faith at all. We're all more or less taught the same things, that, we have a sort of ethos of tolerance and respect. And I actually feel that probably Judaism is the most misunderstood faith of all. I cannot understand why, considering it is the oldest faith. What concerns me most of all is that when there is a choice involved, certainly for GCSE and A-level examinations, that Judaism often seems to be left out in favour of a choice of, another two faiths. I think Judaism should be there along with all the other faiths as well. There should be equal time devoted to the study of Judaism as there is to Christianity, Islam.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned there the Abrahamic faiths have that connection, and not only in their history, but also in their attitude towards non-judgmental and tolerance. Are there any other sort of connections that you see between these three faiths?
Well, I suppose it's fair to say that Jesus himself, being Jewish, being called a rabbi, being called a teacher, a preacher, Christianity is just a kind of extension of Judaism, but from a different sort of theological angle. But whereas a number of Jewish people will say that, Jesus had nothing to do with this, well, he does. You can't escape the fact that, he was a Jew. He practiced Judaism, and also people seem to forget that on the night before he was arrested, he actually held a Passover meal with his disciples, and that is very much part of the Jewish tradition. Passover being equivalent to Easter in the Christian faith. It's a very important time of year. It's a time when communities and families come together.
And it's interesting because I do think the sort of Jewishness of Jesus is sometimes omitted. And I think a lot of, certainly the children that we teach, kind of have a mistaken understanding that Jesus was a Christian, which makes no sense historically or religiously.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't, no.
No.
But we also have a connection to Islam because we share similar characteristics of, particularly with regard to prayer and dietary laws. We pray at least 3 times a day. We have a prayer for every sort of aspect of day-to-day living. It's very important that, we wash our hands and clean ourselves as much as Muslims do, up to 5 times a day. But also, dietary-wise, we have a similar way of preparing meat. Both our faiths do not allow the consumption of meat from a pig, and also the animal has to be slaughtered in a particular way. And I don't think people understand as well when they are contesting the way that animals are slaughtered. They don't seem to understand that this has been done for thousands of years and will continue to be so. This is what actually defines koshering and halachic meat.
Yeah. I mean, you said earlier that you don't maybe observe the sort of Jewish faith as strictly as you did as a child, but how does your Jewishness impact you today? What does it mean to you today still?
Well, today, my Jewishness is connected very much with the Holocaust and the commemoration of the Holocaust. And even though it's also fair to say that every time we talk about Judaism, there is an immediate association with the Holocaust, this is not the case. The Holocaust is just one aspect that perhaps brings us closer together and that makes us determined to keep our religion and let people know that Judaism has been observed, has been practiced for, thousands of years, and that even a major genocide in the 20th century, would not keep us from being proud of who we are. In fact, if anything, it strengthened our faith and our belief. But Judaism is also about a lot more. It's about positivity. And all that we ever hear of Judaism, particularly with the rise, and this is something obviously that I know we'll be talking about later, but with the rise of anti-Semitism, and with anti-Semitism seemingly in comparison with 80-odd years ago in Nazi Germany, it seems that we have the same myths and stereotypes being perpetrated. And it shows a complete lack of understanding of Jewish ideals and Jewish people. And for me, to be Jewish is not only to remember the Holocaust, and even well before that, when we were slaves in Egypt, which is very much takes up part of our Passover festival, we feel that's an important part as well, that, we would never be slaves again, and that we are for freedom and freedom of speech for everyone. In fact, today, Holocaust Memorial Day, also observes all those other people who have suffered due to genocide since the Holocaust. But for me, Judaism is all about defending myself, speaking out against anti-Semitism, praising the positive sides of Judaism, and also showing that we are also as tolerant, and we should be tolerant towards other faith groups as well.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people feel that the Holocaust was an isolated incident, when actually it is part of a much, much bigger history that started way before then and continues today. So let's focus on that a little bit, and let's just start with what anti-Semitism is, and then maybe distinguish it from anti-Zionism, which is something slightly different.
Well, anti-Semitism is racism, prejudice towards people of the Jewish faith. That's what anti-Semitism is. And it manifests itself in various ways. I think the most common way is to defend the use of myths and stereotypes that have been in existence for thousands of years, really. I mean, the Jews, probably, it's fair to say, have been the most persecuted people. I would say we're in the year 5782, for at least 2,500 years, Jews have been persecuted. That's not to say we don't acknowledge that Christians were also persecuted, particularly at the time of the ancient Romans. Anyone who believed in a deity that was invisible was considered crazy in the Romans' eyes. Therefore, they couldn't understand their obsession with their particular faith. And also, anti-Semitism can also refer to a complete lack of understanding of the Jewish faith, Jewish tradition, Jewish ideals. It can manifest itself through verbal racism, it can be physical, it can be political, And sometimes the Jews are incorporated in general world conspiracies. And this is a newer example of anti-Semitism today, that the conspiracy theories that the Nazis espoused in pre-war Germany are now being used to discredit the Jews even further. And this is what has led to the document known as the International Definition of Anti-Semitism, which I always refer to now to kind of justify some of the things that are being said today. So anti-Semitism is that prejudice towards Jewish people.
Okay. And then how would you distinguish that from anti-Zionism?
Well, this is the difficulty. Well, first of all, Zionism is the belief in the right of a Jewish state to exist. That's what Zionism is. And considering there is only one Jewish state in the world today, and it's one of the youngest countries in the world, Israel, which was founded in 1948. If you are anti-Zionist, it actually means that you do not believe the Jews have a right to their own state, that the idea of a Jewish state is in itself racist. And this has actually come under the definition of anti-Semitism, that to deny the right of a Jewish state to exist is in itself anti-Semitic. So therefore, if an anti-Zionist says, I have nothing against Jews, I hate Israel, Israel should not be allowed to exist. This is where we get the confusion between the two, and often today, anti-Zionism is used as an excuse for anti-Semitism. There is no difference. If you are anti-Zionist, you are anti-Semitic. You are denying the Jews a place of residence, really. In the same way that if I were to say that, I am not against Muslims, but I don't think Islamic State should be allowed to exist. I think Iran and Iraq should be wiped off the face of the earth. That would be an equally abhorrent thing to say. The other thing we need to know and realise is that a lot of non-Jewish people are Zionists as well. By the very fact that they support the idea, doesn't mean you have to go and live in Israel. People who support the idea, yes, Israel has a right to exist, it has a right to defend itself if attacked, they themselves become Zionists. In past years, people have said, Zionists are those people who settled in Israel. When we consider that, many of those settlers were survivors of the Holocaust, they needed somewhere to live because the countries they'd actually been thrown out of didn't want them back. For many years afterwards, they just didn't want them. There's a term called the wandering Jew. The Jews have never really had a country to call their own.
And I guess it's one of our basic human rights, isn't it? Is the right to a nationality.
Well, it is,
and the right to a home.
Yes.
And actually, I can't imagine there's anyone listening who doesn't believe that people deserve to have a nationality and people deserve to have a country they call their own. And actually in this country, if you are English and live in this country, you have a home, you have a nationality, you have a passport, you have an identity.
Exactly.
And that is one of our basic human rights, isn't it?
Yeah. I just want to read something from the International Definition of Anti-Semitism, which hopefully will clear this up. Because one thing I must say, and I always say, particularly when I'm talking to students in school, is that there is nothing wrong with criticising the policies of the State of Israel, as you would any other country. But this is what's happening. It says here, manifestations of anti-Semitism might include the targeting of the State of Israel conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel, similar to that levelled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitism. So there is nothing wrong with criticising Israel as a state and its policies. Many Jewish people will criticise certain of its policies. That doesn't mean we hate Israel and Israel should not exist.
Yeah.
We can criticise the policies of any other country where, we have concerns about the level of restrictions against certain groups of people. That does not make us racist. It does not make us anti-Islam, anti-Zionist, or anti-Semitic. It's the targeting of Jews as being collectively responsible for the actions of Israel that is anti-Semitic.
Yeah, that's a really good clarification. Thank you. I mean, we've talked about the fact that anti-Semitism is not a modern invention, it's not an isolated thing, it's something that's happened and sort of for about 2,500 years, starting with slavery within the Egyptian times, up until the Holocaust and today. What are some of the other sort of anti-Semitic historical acts that have happened within the last 2,500 years?
Right, well, there were the expulsion of Jews from their lands. There was, particularly at the time of Jesus' birth, the Jews were sort of under Roman occupation. They were under Roman rule and they had to abide by that. And of course, the Romans had very little patience. They didn't understand the Jewish ideology and the theological aspect of it, particularly as regards, as I've said, the sort of invisible deity. But also they felt that their practices were alien to what the Romans stood for. So we're actually seeing this today in a number of countries. The eradication or the attempt to eradicate thousands of years of tradition of a particular faith group because the occupying force does not believe in it and won't allow them to continue that way. We're actually seeing this in major countries at the moment. In countries that perhaps are overwhelming in their vastness, really. And if a country can believe that there are certain citizens who do not deserve to live there unless they convert to a particular way of thinking, that is prejudice. And then if we move on from that, particularly into medieval times, when the Jews were still a kind of invited race. They were a group of people they were living in many European cities, amongst others, and at one time they were actually under the protection of the crown. But not because the king had any particular sympathy towards Jews. The Jews, finding themselves, for instance, they weren't allowed to conduct themselves in normal day-to-day work. The Jews were only used for money lending. And this is why they came under the king's protection, because they were giving money to the king for fighting wars, for building monuments and castles, contributing funds towards, the war and the Crusades, for instance, and the Jews were then protected. But that didn't always happen, and if the king was out of the country, if there was no one to protect them, I'm sad to say, sometimes the church itself would turn against them. And we have examples of massacres in places such as York, in Norwich and Lincoln, which all had large Jewish populations. They were viewed with suspicion. They were accused, again by the church, of what was called the blood libel, which was the slaughtering of innocent children who were drained of blood. Their blood was mixed with wine, and it would be drunk to gain immortality. This is one of the myths and stereotypes, unfortunately, that persists today. And following one of these particular acts, when the Jews were accused of murdering children who had simply either vanished or had had an accident, they were expelled from England for about 350 years. So between the period 1290 and 1650 and beyond, the Jews were not allowed back in England and in other European countries. In Spain, during the 16th century, the Spanish Inquisition tortured Jews, tried to convert them to Christianity. If they didn't, they were killed. So the Jews was always under threat. So anti-Semitism sort of persisted throughout that period.
So there seems to be a sort of history of stereotyping, of scapegoating, of creating these tropes that are just completely fallacious.
Yes.
Throughout history, and that we as a country in England are responsible for part of that. Because I think some people feel that England has always supported the sort of Jewish nation, the Jewish state, and actually if you look back in history, that's not always the case at all.
That's not the case.
Let's think about sort of anti-Semitism today, and what does it actually look like?
Anti-Semitism has become uglier. Whereas at the start I was educating children about the Holocaust itself, highlighting little-known facts and relating it to my own personal family story, being the son and grandson of refugees, and how they managed to escape from Germany. But in the last 2 years particularly, we have seen an increase in the use of, as you mentioned before, stereotypes and anti-Semitic tropes, and the old blood libel has been coming up again. And this has led to not just verbal abuse, but also social media abuse, which has really led to the renewal of anti-Semitic events and slurs. Social media has a huge part to play in this, and they haven't really taken action soon enough to curb this. They say they do, but they don't. And we've also had physical attacks on people all around the world. We've had acts of terrorism aimed specifically at Jewish people. Not only at Jewish people, but specifically the Jews have been targeted. There are people today who claim that, and this is particularly galling, this is something that I find really difficult to try and come to terms with, that there are people who believe that the Jews got what they deserved, that the Holocaust was something just waiting to happen, that Hitler failed in his mission to eradicate Jews from the face of the earth, that the remaining Jews today should all be sent back to the gas chambers, that there is no place for Jews in any country whatsoever, that the Jews are a privileged group of people, that they control everything, they control the courts, they control the banks. These are the old anti-Semitic tropes when Jews were made scapegoats in Nazi Germany, but people actually believe this. And if that wasn't bad enough, we've then got Holocaust deniers who say the whole thing was a fake. It was just something that never happened. And there are people who believe this. And I'm reminded of what Joseph Goebbels said as Hitler's propaganda minister. He said, the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it. And that's what seems to be happening. And part of this, in fact, a large part of this, has to do with the almost normalisation of anti-Semitism that happened when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. And I'm not saying that Labour are the only party to exhibit anti-Semitic behaviour, because this has happened in other parties as well, but Labour were the ones who seemed to think that it was okay, that the Jews don't understand irony, as Corbyn once said, that they deserve everything they get.
Can you give an example of something that Corbyn said that you found particularly anti-Semitic, just so that we can really clarify what we're talking about here?
He said the Jews do not understand irony. They will never understand irony. They don't understand what we are getting at. They fail to see. What he was referring to, in fact, was he was saying they don't seem to understand their past misdemeanours, almost saying that the Jews were responsible for what happened to them during the Holocaust, that it was something just waiting to happen. Plus the fact that Corbyn supported a number of anti-Semitic posts and slurs made by members of his own party. He failed to act upon them. When some of his own MPs were singled out in meetings and humiliated, I'm thinking of Ruth Smith, for one, and there was Luciana Berger, who actually ended up needing police protection because her own party said, she needs to be assassinated. That he didn't take any action. So, whereas some people will gladly say, oh, well, he's not responsible for it, the accusations of anti-Semitism with the Labour Party are completely unjustified. We've had high-profile celebrities, such as the director Ken Loach. We've even had self-loathing Jews such as the actress Miriam Margolyes and the director Mike Lee saying there's nothing wrong with Labour. I'm afraid there is. I'm not saying anti-Semitism wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for them, because it existed long before that. They were only exacerbating the situation.
Yeah. And again, it's not isolated. And part of what has inspired me to talk to you was the comments by Wiley recently on social media. And we've talked about Mel Gibson, John Barnes, Roger Waters, Brian Eno, that actually you've got very, very high-profile people within the public eye that are making comments.
I think if people are not followers of Wiley, if they weren't aware of what Wiley, Roger Waters, or Brian Eno, or the Professor David Miller, who was sacked from Bristol University because of his onslaught against Jewish students and Zionism, we need to know the things that they said. For instance, Wiley compared Jews to the Ku Klux Klan, two sets of people who nobody has really wanted to challenge. He also advanced an anti-Semitic trope that Jewish people control business interests, comparing them to the Ku Klux Klan. And he has rejected the charge of anti-Semitism, saying, forget anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitic racism is racism. It's not. It's okay, in other words. And then we've got Roger Waters joining the BDS movement, which basically bans any cooperation between Israel in business and entertainment issues. He tried to persuade a number of artists in the music industry. to refuse to perform in Israel. Many sort of told him he didn't know what he was talking about. But he has a large following. Brian Eno also puts forward the same ideas. Roger Waters branded the British Jewish community over their allegations of anti-Semitism. He said, "You're making it all up. It's a smear." And then we've got David Miller, erstwhile professor at Bristol University. The authorities took ages to finally sack him. He was making life for Jewish students impossible. He spent hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of student grant to pursue his vendetta against Israel and Zionism. And he said that all Jews are under the control of the Zionist media. So those are the sort of things that sound the alarm. Because if people follow those ideas, if they appear on social media, if they appear on YouTube, it gives even more clout to these people. And people will say, well, if they're willing to say this, they must be right, because they can't be lying. And this is how prejudice and racism spreads, and misinformation.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's not necessarily just what they're saying, although that is horrific, but it's also the reaction to it, or the inaction. Mm-hmm. People not challenging it.
Yes.
Or them not coming to justice when they are saying things. I'm not sure how you feel about the cancel culture, whether you think that's helpful, that actually people say things that are controversial, we just ban them, or whether actually they should actually be made to stand up and be accountable for what they're saying.
This is a very personal view of mine, Louisa. I'm very concerned about cancel culture, and I've always been very concerned about so-called political correctness, because I think most right-minded people know when something they say can be misconstrued and can appear wrong. I think we learn from history. The very fact that history is studied in schools and universities, and the fact that we rely a lot on history to help us improve, to help us look at what happened and how we can make things move on. If we start to ignore that and say that we no longer need, the campaign, for instance, to smear Winston Churchill. And I know for a fact that when Winston Churchill was a young man, he did have some very sort of common anti-Semitic beliefs about Jewish people. But like most intelligent people, you suddenly come to realise, particularly, with the Holocaust, that he was wrong. Even the writer H.G. Wells felt that the Jews were perhaps, a rather dangerous race of people. After the Holocaust, he lived long enough to actually see what happened in the Holocaust. He actually wrote a letter of apology to Chaim Weizmann in Israel and just said, I could never have conceived that something like this would happen. So it's the way people are perceived. What cancel culture is doing is actually saying, oh, that never happened. Or if it did happen, you don't need to know about it. Yes, we do. We do need to know that many of our cities and our public figures in the past and the monuments that were erected to them, they had a very questionable history. But this was what life was like. This was the norm until William Wilberforce put forward his anti-slavery ideas and slavery was eventually abolished. It's still happening today. In many countries, we're still having people browbeaten because they are considered an inferior group or an inferior faith group or an inferior minority group. So I think all cancel culture does is make us ignorant of what we should know in order to improve ourselves and think of the best way forward. We need to acknowledge this is what happened. Most people don't know, for instance, that both Britain and America didn't want to receive any sort of refugees from Nazi Germany because they felt that the Jews were a bad influence. It was only begrudgingly they allowed the first group of refugees in. Even after the war, for 10 years after the war, the Jews were blamed for what had happened to them. So it didn't disappear.
And actually, it almost links to something else that we've spoken about before, which is the omission or the censorship of the Jewish experience.
Yes.
The cancel culture seems to feed into that a little bit, doesn't it? Because it hides it away. Let's not put it in the public eye. Let's pretend it's not happening. Mm-hmm. And what you're actually doing is denying the experience of those that are victims of anti-Semitism.
Yes, that's true. The other thing is that within cancel culture, we have also the diversity issue. And there are many sort of diversity organisations sent up to tackle misinformation, and there's education against hatred. These are all very, very good things. I worry, though, that when we have organisations such as these, and then other ones such as Black Lives Matter, I can understand the ideas behind them. But it's very funny that within diversity and within the number of people and organisations I've contacted, Judaism doesn't seem to count. Jewish people are not considered diverse enough, and there are even calls that being Jewish is not belonging to a minority group, that Jews are not considered in that, and that Jews are the only people to deal with prejudice. And yet the whole idea of, for instance, Black Lives Matter is to make all of us aware of the history of how black people have been treated, up to the slavery that led to the Civil War, and then beyond that, and the way black people are perhaps characterised and unfairly treated today. But this also happens to Jews. We see it in the media as well. The media is very keen to show us a diverse population of the community, whether it's in adverts or in soaps or in drama serials or in the number of newsreaders they had. This is all, it's a great idea. But in doing so, we're in danger of making it almost inverse racism. One thing that's always puzzled me, and perhaps if people pay more attention to it, they might realise that when you watch the adverts on TV, they feature an awful lot of mixed-race families. But I've never seen a Jewish family, or I've never seen a sort of Jewish Christian family. It's very easy, obviously, with Asian and the black person, because we know physically they would look different. But with Jewish people, we don't all walk around with skull caps, black beards and long coats. How would you do that? But it still can be done. Why are Jews always portrayed as figures of ridicule in series like Friday Night Dinner? To me, it only seems the Americans seem to understand the duality and the kind of superficiality of Jewish practice, but not the British. Jewish people should become regular characters, not just there for political correctness, making a point when producers say, we need more black characters in this storyline, or we need more disabled characters. I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. To me, it seems like inverse racism. I suppose they'd say it was positive discrimination, but positive discrimination is discrimination. There's got to be some ways of looking at it. Why aren't Jewish people featured as much as other members of the minority community? Although I must admit I do hate that term, because basically we're all the same. The fact that we have different religions, the fact that we are a different colour, the fact we have a disability, that should really have nothing to do with it. But I don't think people are ready to understand that yet at the moment, which is a shame.
Yeah. I mean, I want to talk a bit more about this in terms of what we can do, that actually what are the solutions to this? But just before I do that, what I want to talk about, if you're happy to do that, is to think about what is the impact on the Jewish community of anti-Semitism, of discrimination. And I know you personally have had some experiences that you may or may not feel comfortable talking about.
I'm happy to talk about them because I'm quite honest with the students as well, because in a way this has made me the person I am today, so I don't mind. I suffered the usual type of abuse at school, which, it started by when they found out I was Jewish. I mean, I'm not ashamed to be Jewish, far from it, but you don't walk around making a point of it. Neither do you go around saying, I'm a Christian, look at me, I've got a cross around my neck. It's not like that when you have a faith, and particularly if you are, like me, not an Orthodox Jew, but just someone who happens to be Jewish. So they would call me things like, you stupid Jew, you big-nosed Jew, you tight Jew, which of course refers to the myths and stereotypes about Jewish people, all having big noses and being tight with money. And then they would use derogatory terms such as Yid, which I find probably is the most offensive word you can use against a Jewish person. It's an abbreviated form of the word Yiddish, which is an ancient language mixed of German and Hebrew, which was, it's still spoken by some of the older community today. But a Yid is as offensive to Jews as Pakik would be to an Asian person.
Yeah.
Then they call you a Heb or a Christ killer. It seems that, for years we had to accept that until a number of years ago the Catholic Church actually apologised, said that, we mustn't call the Jews Christ killers and everything. But it still sticks. So as a young boy of 11 and 12, it did affect me.
Yeah.
It was bullying, basically. It was racist bullying. And when I tried to laugh it off, that's what I did at first. It just seemed to make it worse. And when I actually went and I was pressured into going to see a member of staff, they just said, because I went to a boys' school, they said, don't be a sissy. just man up. They don't know what they're talking about. And besides there's nothing you can do about it. I remember my father getting into an argument with one of my teachers who said you should just sit back and take it. My dad gave him a few choice words after that. But eventually, you get over that. When I went to university, I had no problems there at all. Nothing really happened until I was in my very first teaching post. And it was during the last 2 years of this post at this school that I suddenly encountered, out of the blue as it were, racist comments from students at first. They would pretend to sneeze in front of me and go, "A Jew!" And I thought, how did they know? How did they know? Because even though I taught music mainly, I did teach a little bit of RE. But no one ever said, "Oh, do you know so much about Judaism because you're Jewish?" No one ever asked me that. And it wasn't about that anyway. Because anyone of any faith can teach religion, can teach about other faiths as well. But it's when they started muttering words like Jew and Yid and drawing. I found these little sort of sketches in their jotters and sometimes scrawled onto desks and walls of stick figures with big noses and long sideburns and skull caps. And I remember going to a colleague of mine and telling him what was happening, and he said, "I don't know what you're so upset about. There's nothing wrong with it. You are a Jew. That's all they're doing is calling you a Jew." And I said, "Right." So in that case, I said, if I was black and someone called me a nigger or a wog or go back and climb up the banana tree, that would be acceptable. He said, "Well, that's completely different." I said, "No, it's not different." I said, "It's equally racist, equally abhorrent." I said, calling me, if I was Asian, calling me a Paki or calling me a terrorist, that would be unacceptable. I went to the headmaster. The headmaster didn't know how to deal with it. He said, "I'm going to give some assemblies. I'm not going to mention you by name, but I'm going to say that this sort of behaviour just shouldn't be allowed." And I said, "Please don't do that. You'll only make it work. It needs to be dealt with internally. We need to get the ones responsible and talk to them." And he said, "No," he said, "I know what I'm doing is right." Well, he did mention it in assembly, and everyone knew he was talking about me. Everyone knew by then. And what happened was I became a bit paranoid, wondering where the next, attack would come from. I mean, it was verbal. The anti-Semitism was verbal, but believe me, it is very, very upsetting, oppressive, intimidating. It makes you lose all confidence in yourself, makes you lose your self-esteem. And eventually I became very, very nervy. I would wake up in the morning with panic attacks, which feels like you're having a heart attack. And eventually I went to the doctor and I broke down in his surgery. And he said, "You need time off to reflect, but don't do anything rash." I didn't want my teaching career to end. And even while I was off, it actually turned out into a whole half term. And I was sent to see a occupational health advisor. And then I went to see a counsellor. And I seemed to get my confidence back gradually. But I knew things had to change. So I returned to the school and things hadn't changed at all. And eventually I just decided I couldn't stand it anymore. So I was off for about 6 months, during which time I decided to just retire from teaching. And when I'd recovered, in fact, at one point it got so bad that I wished I was dead. And actually one day I did actually consider walking into the path of a lorry. But somehow I thought that would be the cowardly way out and my family would suffer. And I can't leave them like that. So eventually I'd always had the support of my union rep at the time, and he suggested that we go and see the chief education officers at Chester because it was under Cheshire County Council. And I went to see them when I was feeling at my lowest. And by then, I'd taken the authority to a tribunal, accusing them of, anti-Semitism, not doing anything about it, not helping me, causing me to be ill, to lose so much time off work. And after discussions, we resolved it in a way, but I never went back to that school at all. And I gave up teaching for about 2 years, but I went back because I thought that I am a teacher. I will always be a teacher and nothing's going to stop me. So actually it made me a stronger person. But even though I feel much better now, this happened 25 years ago. that I still get flashbacks. I still get nightmares. And whenever I hear of any anti-Semitism in the news, on social media, any high-profile person, I just want to take action. I want to do something about it. And this is why, at the moment, I'm spending time talking about the history of anti-Semitism at schools. And I'm trying to explain to children, young and older, what we can do to fight it, that we need to call out any form of racism, no matter how small, even if it's just name-calling, because that's how it starts. And if we leave it, it'll fester, it'll gather momentum, it'll get worse until it gets to a situation where it's out of control. We need to call it out, we need to stand up to it, we need to make people aware of what it involves.
Freddie, I do want to say, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I know that all of us listening to that are heartbroken. What seems to be key is education. So not hiding it away, but talking about it, talking about experiences and tackling it head on.
Yes.
Not through punishment, but through education. And a lot of this is naivety, and cancel culture and denying the experiences just makes people even more ignorant, and therefore you can't tackle it. So I feel that our responsibility as RE teachers is to talk about this and to get people like you into our schools, to talk to our young people and educate them about something which people don't realise is still happening, and sort of put it in a little World War II box and don't think about the bigger picture. Do you feel that's what is needed?
It is. We need to talk about, it's been my unfortunate experience to contact a number of schools who have said to me that we feel we cover the Holocaust quite sufficiently. We have a survivor to visit us once a year. Well, I'm sorry, but that is not covering the Holocaust at all. And most of these survivors now are elderly, they're ailing. There'll be a time when they won't be able to travel or come into school anymore, or some of them might not even live much longer. Who is going to keep those memories alive? And besides, it's not just about what happened in the past. It's about what's happening today. That people still believe that the Holocaust was a myth. This is one of the examples of anti-Semitism. People don't realise that denying the Holocaust is part and parcel of what anti-Semitism is. And things need to be addressed in a more understanding way. And it's not helped when one of our major national broadcasters, the BBC, twist stories. In a recent case, it was when a coachload of Orthodox Jews, Jewish children, were participating in an event to celebrate Hanukkah, and they were abused by mainly Asian men who were making the Hitler salute, the Heil Hitler salute, raising their arms and calling them all sorts of names. The BBC twisted it to say this only happened because one of the Jewish children used a racial slur against one of the Muslims. And after a police investigation, that turned out to be completely false. The BBC haven't even apologised. But there is a long history of institutionalised anti-Semitism at the BBC. And heads must roll. Heads should roll.
Absolutely.
I'm reminded of a few years ago when, with horror, I noticed on an A-level religious studies paper there was a question which said, why do people hate the Jews? I thought to myself, what if that had been reworded, why do people hate Muslims? Why do people hate Buddhists? Why do people hate gay people? And so on and so on and so on. And I just wrote to the board and said, this is a very unfair and irresponsible question. And they said, well, we're sorry it caused such upset. We did have some very good answers. And I said, but it's very irresponsible because you're actually justifying anti-Semitism. You're asking people to justify anti-Semitism. It has the same effect as a book. A title of a book I saw on sale, not just on Amazon, but in many bookstores. It's called Are Jews Responsible for 9/11? And yeah, people will buy this book and they will read it and they'll look at some idiot's conspiracy theory about why he believes the Jews are responsible for the loss of life, on that particular day.
And even if they don't read it or buy it, that title just plants a seed.
The title alone is enough to sell people on that point. So it needs to be addressed. I think within RE, we need to emphasise the positives about Judaism, as well as talking about customs and traditions. and that Judaism is not necessarily the first thing you will connect with the Holocaust. As another teacher said to me, we don't want it to be that whenever we talk about Judaism, we talk about the Holocaust, because we need to talk about what happened before then and how Jews live their lives in general, what everything means, what certain prayers mean, what certain festivals mean, what we are celebrating, what we are commemorating. And we need to talk about the misconception, the misunderstanding of certain Jewish values can be turned into a kind of question about the very ethos of Judaism itself, that maybe it's a bad religion, that it only creates negative thoughts, that whenever you mention Judaism, it's something bad. And that's, I think, the problem. With younger children, it's much easier. When I've been into primary schools, I've talked about all the good things of Judaism. I've shown them artifacts. I've shared, Jewish food with them, bagels and matzah, and we've talked about the festivals. But they also need to know that Jews are persecuted people and they are often unfairly maligned. But whenever there is a major anti-Semitic incident, it's not given the attention it deserves. It's sort of pushed back. It's as if anti-Semitism doesn't exist, or if it does, we don't want to know about it. That's my concern.
Absolutely. And so actually, as RE teachers, we have a responsibility to, one, provide a really beautiful, positive experience of the Jewish faith, but also to tackle, highlight and challenge the anti-Semitism that exists within our culture. And that's our privilege to do that. And I think it's also our responsibility, isn't it? And people like you can come in and help us to do that effectively. Brilliant. Freddie, are you happy to tell us a little bit more about the story of your grandparents?
Yes, of course. It's very important for me to tell their story over and over again, because being a second generation family member, it's really up to me to keep their memories alive. And I think that most children or grandchildren of, relatives who were around at the time of the Holocaust, either who escaped or unfortunately were inmates themselves, the story really does need to be told for the next generation. So this is something I learnt much, much later in my life, because I may have explained that when I was at school, when I attended the Jewish Sunday school, the Holocaust was never discussed. My parents, my grandmother never spoke about her experiences. So it was mainly through me prompting. And I think it followed a visit to the Yad Vashem in Israel that was the first time I realised there was something deeper below the surface here. But again, it took a long while for it to come out. So basically, my grandparents and my mother were from Bavaria in Germany. And as soon as Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, my grandfather was one of a small number of people who knew that things would not get better. Whereas other people would dismiss it as, Hitler's here today, gone tomorrow, and the world will wake up and they'll recognise what kind of a person he is. This, was just wishful thinking. My grandfather could actually see what was going to happen. He had built up a very successful clothing business. As a young man, he'd studied in Nottingham, studied the lace trade in Nottingham. So he went into the clothing trade with his wife, with my grandmother, and he owned a big factory. In 1934, my grandfather made the difficult decision then to leave Germany. And when he told my grandmother, at first she didn't want to do it. First of all, she couldn't speak any English. She wondered if things would be better elsewhere. And it was when my grandfather said, well, I'll tell you what's happening at the moment. There are some people who live further down our road, and the other night some Nazis came into their house, dragged them out, took them into the forest and shot them dead. And this was happening all over. But most people weren't aware of it. My granddad heard it from someone else who said it's beginning now, it's starting already. So he said we could go to one of three places. We could go to America, we could go to Palestine as it was then, or we could go to England where I've been. I can speak English. And in the end, that's where they opted to go. My mother was only 2 years old. She was a child. She didn't really understand. She doesn't remember much about that. But in 1934, they arrived in England. And even though they couldn't bring really anything of value with them, my granddad had very bravely smuggled 2 gold bars into his luggage. And they never checked. You know, he wanted some capital to sort of build up a new life, really. So they arrived at customs, and eventually they settled in Manchester. My grandfather wasn't one to sit around feeling sorry for himself, and gradually he built up a brand new business, clothing business, and he employed around 40 people in his factory. When the war began, my granddad was interned as an enemy alien, and he was just days away from getting his British citizenship. So this was a double blow, really. They were locking up people they considered to be enemy. But thanks to the family solicitor, because he was running a business, because he was contributing to the economy, he was out within, I think it was about 6 weeks. But I remember my grandma saying that the government were writing to people saying, could you supply more to family members whose husbands had been taken away to internment camp? They said, could you supply us with more furniture? We've got nothing here, nothing to sit on, no tables, no chairs. Anyway, eventually when he came out, he got on with his life again, working the business with my grandmother. My mother had started primary school by then. However, just before the war, my grandfather had tried very, very hard to persuade my grandmother's brother and his wife, that's my great aunt and uncle, to come to England as well. But unfortunately, they left it too late. And despite the fact that my grandfather had pleaded with the government and with other people, with all he needed, all my great uncle would have needed was a letter saying there's a job waiting for him. He was a teacher, he was a very skilled singer, he was a cantor in a synagogue, but he was also a very clever man. And, well, the British government said, no, we can't bring any more people over. So they were trapped in Germany, and the inevitable happened. They were rounded up, sent to a camp, and eventually, around about 1941, 42, they were sent to Auschwitz, where they were sent to the gas chambers. And there's a terrible tragic irony in this, because, like my grandfather, my great-uncle Arthur was a soldier in World War I in the German army. There were over 100,000 German Jews fighting in the German army during World War I for their fatherland. And both my granddad and my great-uncle won medals for bravery. In fact, my uncle won the Iron Cross, the highest honour you can give for bravery. And he was gassed in the trenches, but survived. So it's a tragic irony that he actually died in a man-made gas chamber, along with his wife, my great-aunt Elsa. My grandmother never, ever got over that. And she could never forgive Germany. Despite the reparation that they made, she could never forgive. She never went back to Germany. She would always deny she was German. She would say she was Swiss. She became known in our community as the big Swiss lady. She was quite a formidable woman, my grandmother, and she lived to the ripe old age of 95. Fortunately, my granddad passed away at the age of 66, before I was even born. And also, my great-grandmother, my grandmother's stepmother, she didn't come over to England at first. And she was actually in danger of being rounded up in Germany, but very cleverly, even though it's very difficult, she managed to get to France, where she had some cousins, thinking she'd be safe there. But then when the Nazis invaded France and the Vichy government decided it's better to collaborate, all for an easy life, the Jews were all rounded up with the help of the Vichy government and the police, and she was sent to a concentration camp. But in a way she was lucky in that, well, I believe she was in a camp in a small town in France called Gurs, G-U-R-S, Gurs, and she was never moved from there, which is quite incredible considering she was an elderly lady at the time. And I think that actually saved her life. I have a feeling that camp was overseen by the Vichy government. And it was just a miracle that she survived several years there. And when she came back, after the war my granddad brought her back to England from France, she never ever spoke about her experiences. Never. The family never asked her. But she always remained very positive, very happy, always smiling. But again, like my granddad, she died when I was only a baby. So I never knew her.
And it's incredible, isn't it, that someone that you never met, you owe so much to. So your granddad and the decisions that he made, you owe your life to him.
Well, this is what I tell the students. I say, if it wasn't for my granddad, I certainly wouldn't be here today.
Yeah.
My mum wouldn't have met my father. Things just wouldn't be the same. I said, you have to think to yourself, we're very lucky. Other people were not.
Yeah.
But what's important for me is, if someone said, what's your criteria? What makes you a Holocaust educator? What makes you want to speak about this really very difficult period in history? Because, there's a lot of people like me, even younger than me, who just can't talk about it or won't. I think it's my duty. For me, if someone said, who are you? I would say, well, I am Freddy Naftel. I am Jewish, but I just happen to be Jewish. That's my faith. I am a British Jew. But I am the son and grandson of refugees. I am the great-grandson of a Holocaust survivor, and I'm the great-nephew of 2 victims, 2 out of the 6 million victims of Nazi Holocaust. And for me, that is important. So what I emphasise to the students is that when people deny the Holocaust, when I read of yet another case of anti-Semitism, it hits me, it hurts, it really does. And I have to sort of take a step back and be very, very sort of plain speaking about this, how it actually affects me as a Jew to know this kind of thing is still going on today. And conspiracy theories are being passed around, in very high circles, in some case, around the world.
Yeah. And I think you're right, that the hurt of denying someone's lived experience, it's not okay. And I think something else I get from your story, and thank you so much for sharing it, is this is not a simple issue. That it wasn't a man called Hitler who had this plan, that this was ideology of a party that reflected ideology within a continent. And that actually a lot of the suffering, it wasn't just at the hands of Germans, but of a British government that refused to help people that were asking for it.
Yes, if we look at the situation today with refugees fleeing persecution, countries, in some cases, not everyone, but some countries are bending over backwards to accommodate these people. But there was a time when Great Britain didn't want any of the refugees. They said, the Jews are a bad influence. I couldn't actually believe that. Even after the war, they were saying, what are they doing here? We don't want people like this here. Even those Jews who fled to Israel, well, it was still Palestine at the time, they met resistance from the people who were living there because no one wanted to understand or comprehend the enormity of what was happening around the world, particularly in Europe. Whereas today, because we have the internet and we can see things happening all over the world, there's no longer any question of this. Whereas 80 years ago, people, in some cases, they didn't want to believe what was happening. Yeah. So I am trying to put people in that position because the situation particularly regarding the rise of anti-Semitism today is actually getting worse. And there have been a number of incidents. I discuss, a lot of these with the various schools and organisations I go to speak to. But the situation is very, very serious indeed, and it's not being acknowledged either.
And if people want to get in contact with you and discuss having you come and talk to their children, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Well, I have a page on LinkedIn, but I also have an email address, and I'm also on Facebook under Holocaust Enrichment Education. But the best way is if they contact me by email, I can then send details and include feedback and links to other schools where I've worked as well.
I'm sure you'll get a lot of contact following this, because I think a lot of people are going to be really touched by your honesty and your wisdom. So thank you so much, Freddy. So what we'll do is we'll put a link to all of those things in the show notes so that people can contact you, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that will really value the opportunity of your expertise and experience and wisdom. Freddy, just any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, one of the other things I talk about, which I feel is very important, which for me keeps alive the Jewish sort of ethos of family and tradition, is that part and parcel of what I deliver to schools is my own family story and my own reaction to it upon learning about it when I was 16. I had no education on the Holocaust. My parents didn't tell me anything. They didn't talk to us about it at Sunday school. At school, we didn't learn about that period. I learned the hard way, and I feel that my family story shows it's a story of resistance and kind of renewment, really, and how it affected, particularly my grandmother's story, how it affected her for the rest of her life. Because I feel my personal input is very important. My grandmother's reaction and the way she sort of lived for the remainder of her life, and never told me anything about it until one day I said something to her. It was meant to be a joke, and it backfired in the most spectacular way, and that's when I suddenly realised how serious the issue was. So I've been trying to find out more ever since that particular day. So anti-Semitism is a much bigger issue than we think about. It's not only to do with the Holocaust. Yes, the Holocaust was a major event in which people started to realise how one nation could suddenly make life difficult for a particular group of people, a particular faith group, not forgetting the other minority groups that they persecuted at the time as well.
That's an amazing legacy as well, isn't it, to honour her life and honour her experience. It's wonderful to have this chat just ahead of Holocaust Memorial Day on the 27th of January this year. So I know that that's going to be a significant time to really think about these issues and what they mean in the 21st century, that this is not just a single event, this is an ongoing lived experience of Jewish people around the world today. So, Freddie, thank you so much for your time. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is. I just proved it to you. But thank you so much for listening to me pour the life out of you.